Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I see a few more people are joining. We'll go ahead and get started with introductions. This webinar will be around SAP HANA architecture and where to place a HANA environment and the different options you have when designing HANA. A little bit about myself. My name is Nick Militich. I'm going to be giving the webinar today. I've been in the IT industry over 15 years. Over 12 of those years dedicated with SAP and have had experience in deploying and designing HANA environments, specifically around cloud infrastructures and on-premise infrastructures. I do come from Managecore. We are a technical SAP basis firm. We do technical SAP management. We do cloud hosting, whether it is in a public cloud or our own private cloud, and we offer assistance from start to finish when deploying and maintaining SAP from a technical aspect, so anything basis related. So getting started with the architecture design and figuring out really when and where you want to insert that into a HANA project. When it comes to a roadmap to HANA, there are many clients out there that ask, when is the right time to discuss infrastructure? Now, in a traditional SAP environment, that can come later. You know, there are really 4 steps. You go through evaluation, right through prototyping, and get into the realization, and then steady state support. And anywhere between the prototyping and realization is when you would historically go into a design and implementation of standard SAP non-HANA. And with HANA, it's a little different. HANA requires specific hardware, specific configurations, and with that, the real urgent time to do that is during the evaluation period. So you want to really start those conversations right out of the gate, because it could impact how you deploy your environment, where you deploy it, and cost. Now, through this presentation, you're going to see that I focus on mainly 3 decision criteria: flexibility and scalability, supportability, and cost. Now, that will vary depending on your certain circumstance, but generally, these are the top 3 decision criteria that clients will review as they deploy HANA. Now, with flexibility and scalability, you really want to know how does it flex with your business, and that's not just increasing, that could be decreasing resources. You may have workloads that require both, such as busy times during the year. And ROI, design limitations, there is scale up versus scale out. So do you have one server, do you have multiple servers in a scale out configuration making up your HANA environment? And then really ease of use. How hard is it to deploy HANA when you need it and deploy additional instances? From a supportability standpoint, you really want to focus on in-house skills versus MSP providers. How much in-house skills are required for your specific deployment? And I'll go into that in greater detail as we get through the presentation. And during your complete life cycle support, is that adequate? There is a difference between support during a project and support during steady state. And then complexity when it comes to support. Do you need HA? Do you need DR? How many tiers is your environment? And then we finally get to cost. Is OpEx versus CapEx better for your business? And really, are there nice to haves versus actual hard requirements? So is HA and DR specifically a requirement, or would you like to have it, however the cost or whatever the circumstance might be would mitigate the reason for you having that? And then current ROI investments. There are options and opportunities out there to use your existing environment, and maybe you do have hardware that you'd like to utilize given the fact that you could have just purchased it within the last 12 months and you're not quite through the ROI cycle. And cost also does get into play when you talk about employees. Are there skill sets you need to hire for or hire MSPs to help out with that. So during these architecture discussions, really, where does HANA go? And there's two main areas it could go, really a cloud or on-premise. I know it sounds obvious. However, with the cloud, there are two major options. You're going to either put it in a public cloud or a private managed cloud. And with on-premise, you're going to either do a HANA appliance or a tailored data center integration, or as I'll call it, TDI, going through this slide deck. Now we'll start off with the few on-prem options, mainly the TDI and the HANA certified appliance options. And we'll get into the HANA appliance option first. So I'll talk about really what is the HANA appliance and how does it differ from a TDI model. Now, HANA appliance is a bundled hardware solution certified to run SAP, and SAP offers 100% support for that appliance. So when you open an OSS message, for example, it goes through SAP, and SAP will help and assist in driving your issue through completion. And that's very critical to understand versus a TDI model, which I'll get into here shortly. HANA installation is generally performed by a certified vendor. So if you were to purchase your hardware through Dell, for example, they would help and assist in the burn-in and configuring of that HANA environment right through the database. And they would come in and help with that installation piece. They are delivered in specific size configurations. So at times it could be less flexible. If you buy a 256 appliance versus a 512 versus a 1 terabyte, those appliances are limited to the amount of space they have on there. So you really have to take that in consideration when you purchase appliances. All components are included. So compute, network, storage, OS, virtualization if applicable, all that's included. It is really a set it and not quite set it and forget it, but a complete setup when it comes to a HANA environment. There is no configuration required other than what the vendor provides, and you'll have a HANA environment up and running. And generally, less in-house knowledge is required because of that. A lot of the support can be done through the hardware vendor, and requires you to have a little less in-house knowledge to understand that architecture. Not saying that you don't need any knowledge. You will still need to understand HANA and how it works on that hardware, but from a component standpoint, you'll need less. And then, obviously, always reference the certified appliance list to determine the appropriate appliance for your OS and HANA version and size. So there are different, depending on what HANA version and application you have on that specific HANA appliance, will depend on what appliances you're allowed to purchase. So from a tailored data center integration standpoint, we're going to go into that discussion and talk about how it differs and the pros and cons around that versus an on-premise appliance. So TDI really offers you flexibility to use your existing infrastructure to run HANA. Now there are caveats to it, but all in all, if you have current hardware, generally you can use it or some components of it to run HANA. It also allows you to choose preferred vendors for each component. So maybe you like a compute vendor that deals well with servers versus a specific SAN that you're familiar with or have in-house skill set, and network components as well. So whether it's an HP server with EMC SAN, for example, you can pick and choose your specific technologies. And there are certified compute and storage components. However, there are no network certifications. So that means that you need to look at the list when you buy certified hardware, understand what you're buying for compute and storage. But networking, you just have to follow certain specific rules when it comes to how you set up and configure your network. The storage and network are generally more flexible in the TDI model. So, for example, if you were to order an appliance, it would, depending on the size, it would come with a specific disk configuration, for example. And as an example, it may be 10 disks of a certain size that comes with this specific appliance. Well, with TDI, you don't have that constraint. As long as you meet specific KPIs, you can configure your disk, and again, follow the configuration rules. You can configure your disk in such a manner that maybe your SAN uses 20 disks and provides the same type of KPI performance. It really comes down to performance and KPI testing versus the actual configuration. There are a few compute limitations. So compute hardware from different vendors is not supported in scale out, so you can't make a BW environment in a scale out scenario with a mix of Dell and HP servers. They must be identical to the supported appliance model minus storage. So the appliance model itself, right down to almost the SKU, has to be identical to what you see on that certified list. So if you're going to buy a 1 terabyte compute server from Dell, you're going to have to make sure that it is the identical SKU that it would be if you were buying it for the HANA appliance minus the disk. And only supported HANA and OS versions for the specific appliance are supported on that compute hardware. So please, again, reference that list of certified hardware. What you need to understand is that certain hardware with certain processors, and it really does come down to the processor type, whether it's Broadwell or Haswell, will only support certain versions of HANA and certain versions of the applications that you might put on them, such as Suite on HANA S4 or BW on HANA. They all come with different sizing and different specifications depending on the processor. There really is only very few limitations from TDI versus appliance, and that really has to do with scale out scenarios. So you can only have up to 16 worker nodes in a scale out deployment in TDI. However, if you discuss it with SAP, they generally will allow you to go past that. HANA must be installed by a certified HANA consultant, and there is a certification out there. It changes quite frequently, so please go check out the latest when you're getting ready to deploy. However, that installation has to be done by a specific certified consultant. When you get TDI, which is again different from appliance model where the vendor installs it, you'll have to get someone to install HANA for you. There actually is no formal certification for TDI. So it's more of a process and a philosophy that SAP has come with that you need to then adhere to. So you're required to follow the guidelines and use the certified hardware. And because of that, generally TDI is, if you follow those rules, TDI will be something that again, isn't certified. It's just something that you do. KPIs are big with TDI, so you must follow the KPI rules, and you can run them using the SAP HANA configuration check tool, and that is in the note referenced. If you don't want to run them yourself, you can have SAP run a HANA Go Live check, which they recommend, and that will perform those key KPIs that allow you to see if your hardware supports it or not. But I highly recommend, if you're going TDI, to get familiar with that tool. That way you can run it as you add more resources on your shared environment. So for example, if you're actually sharing hardware with, your SAN also shares hardware with non-HANA environments, and it's commingled, you want to make sure that you run that tool frequently as you add systems so that you can tell whether or not HANA will be impacted and meet those KPIs. Virtualization is actually generally performed within a TDI model. There are vendors out there that offer it, but if you actually go look at the certification and certified hardware for appliances, there's actually no appliances that off the cuff offer some virtualization on top of the appliance itself. So virtualization is generally done in a TDI model. However, it can be done in an appliance model. It's just less common. And support is the key differentiator between appliance and TDI. So support is provided in combination with the hardware vendor and yourselves and SAP. So in an appliance model, you can open up an OSS message and it will pass through SAP, and SAP will help facilitate it through all the other channels, whether it's hardware or whatever the case may be. With this, you're kind of on your own. So TDI is a combination of SAP, but mainly your hardware vendor, that you choose for these different components. And if it is multiple ones, you could be in the situation where you have to make sure that you get the right support for those specific technologies. So EMC, for example, if you're running it for your SAN, or Dell hardware if you're running it, or HP Compute, you'd have to get all those vendors together, and the onus would slightly be on you to make sure that all of that and all those people are on board and ready to give you the support you need for your HANA environment. And generally, because of that, greater in-house knowledge or working with an MSP that understands and can understand that environment is required to support a TDI environment. You'll just need more knowledge around that whole infrastructure because it is not an appliance-based. You'll need to know how the interconnects work between the SAN and the compute and the networking and how it's configured, because it is not a quote-unquote canned package. Now I'm going to go into a little bit about virtualization and a real quick overview. I know that virtualization is highly deployed everywhere, and everyone wants to use some form of virtualization generally to get the most out of their hardware. So it's worth a discussion point around it, especially when it comes to on-premise hardware. Virtualization does require a deep knowledge of the hypervisor and the SAP HANA and SAP HANA in general. There is a note out there that will tell you all the latest and greatest supported hypervisors and hardware partitioning technologies. Here's a list as of several weeks ago. Again, anything through this discussion could be slightly outdated based on the different technologies that continually come out, but as of a few weeks ago, this is the current list. And you can see that there's a decent amount of hypervisors and even hardware partitioning technologies that are supported by SAP. In addition to supported technologies, you also can quote-unquote virtualize SAP HANA with multi-tenancy databases, or MDC is what SAP calls it. So as of SP9, you're allowed to actually have multiple databases on a single database instance. So essentially what it is SAP databases are segregated out into a single SAP HANA instance that shares its binaries with all those databases. So it actually allows you to save hardware costs by running SAP on multiple SAP products on a single database instance, but with separate databases. However, the drawback to that is that the binaries have to be patched all at once. So keep that in mind as you're going through and deciding, is multi-tenancy something that actually is worth doing, and can it actually flow with all the SAP products that you're using. So for example, BW and ECC, if you're going to use those in a HANA environment, the patch schedules you'll have to keep ahead of and make sure that you can patch them at the right times. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about VMware, and mainly because it is the most common virtualized platform. Almost everyone runs some form of VMware, whether it's in their SAP environment or not. And this is really made to give you a good example of the different nuances required for each different virtualization platform. And I want to focus on one just to get you a good general idea. So as mentioned, it is generally the most common and widely supported platform of virtualization for SAP. There's a lot of companies out there running traditional SAP on HANA, traditional SAP on virtualization and HANA virtualized with VMware. The processors supported, and this will be a big theme. It really comes down to the processors, whether you're on-prem or cloud or whatever the case may be. Processors supported are the E7 versions and the E5 versions. E7s are general production, and E5s are really for non-production or entry-level production systems. NUMA nodes are a consideration when you go into VMware, and really what that means is you can consider a NUMA node a single CPU processor. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see the blue squares that are CPUs, and effectively this server would have 8 CPUs in it, which would equate to essentially 8 NUMA nodes. Production cannot span NUMA nodes, so that's a big caveat when you're talking about designing SAP HANA on a virtualized environment. However, as of very recently, you can share NUMA nodes, which was not allowed as of a few months ago. Production, however, cannot span NUMA nodes. So you cannot go across multiple NUMA nodes, however, you can share them, and I'll get into that in a little bit in the diagram. And NUMA node sharing, again, allowed in 6.0 and allow in VMware 6.0 and VMware 6.5. And you can tell there, and just again to make my point about the processors, in 6.0 Haswell and Broadwell is supported. In 6.5 only Broadwell processors are supported to do that. And half sharing is allowed, so half socket sharing. So no odd socket sharing. You can't do 1.5 CPUs, you can't do 2.5 CPUs, only 0.5 CPUs. And sharing is only allowed on E7 processors. So the E5s, you're not allowed to share on. And E5s, you're actually only allowed to do 2 processor servers. So there's not much sharing that you could do on those environments. So if you look at the diagram on the side, I'll explain it in a little bit of detail here. If you look at the far left, you'll see a production system connected to a CPU. That is supported because it is a one-to-one NUMA node to production HANA mapping. And if you look to the far right, you can see the 2 CPUs connected to one production HANA environment. So that is again supported because it is not sharing NUMA nodes. However, it is spanning it, and that's okay as long as you use the full NUMA node. If you look at the one directly to the left of that, you can see that there's 2 production HANA environments connected to one CPU. That is what is recently supported, and that is what came out as of about a month ago, and it allows you to share NUMA nodes with production HANA environments. That is the supported model as of today with half socket sharing. So I could not put another production instance on there. If I did, that would not be supported. Now, if you look toward the left, you can see the 2 production instances that are not supported, and that is sharing NUMA nodes with production HANA, spanning and sharing. So production cannot share NUMA nodes with another production instance, as you can see there. I have that production instance and the other production instance sharing that NUMA node. That is not supported. And however, it is supported with non-production environments. So if you can see the sandbox environments, they're spanning, they're sharing. That is okay when it comes to non-production. These rules only apply when it comes to production instances. A little bit into the actual hypervisor and size restrictions. And again, there's documentation out there. I just wanted to give a high level. But ESX, depending on which version, 5.5 or 6.0 and 6.5, the main differences are 1 terabyte in 64 vCPUs versus 4 terabytes in 128 vCPUs per VM. So with the evolution of ESX, you can get a lot larger environment virtualized without having to buy physical hardware only. So you can actually put 4 terabyte systems on a virtualized platform. And 6 terabytes is on the roadmap for 6.5, so they're just continually increasing. One of the benefits to put HANA on ESX are the tools that ESX offers. So items like vMotion, VMware HA, VMware SRM, and DRS, those are all supported tool sets. So it allows you to really take full advantage of maybe hardware you have and virtualization you have. Maybe you're using SRM or Site Recovery Manager to move your environments from one data center to another. That is supported if you virtualize. One caveat, SAP HANA VM should run in the same vSphere cluster with identical hardware. because CPU and processor specifically, their models are so critical, and sizing is based on the exact processor you put it on. It could be a difference between an 18 and a 16 core, an 18 and a 24 core. All of that is sized initially, so you want the same identical hardware. It is highly recommended that you enable hyper-threading, and again, reiterating that processor architecture matters. It will impact everything, and you can see on the side some of the charts there, what's supported, what's not in vSphere. And again, please check the latest documentation when it comes time to do this. Sizing is also a little tricky when it comes to virtualization. You just have to know what you're doing with it. It, again, varies by processor and application. And there are really several methods for sizing, but the main ones are your traditional SAPS ratings, your traditional SAP Quick Sizer, and NUMA node sizing. So minimum vCPU that VMware recommends for non-production is 10 and 16 for production, and that's hyper-threading included. So what that means is if you had a 16-core processor, you really have 8 cores that you would give to, in production, you have 8 cores that you would give to your VM for production, and you have another 8 for hyper-threading. That would get you your 16. So keep that in mind when you're with some of these calculations. You have to include or remove hyper-threading. A real quick judge, if you're already running SAP, is for Suite on HANA. You really want your HANA estimation to be about 3 times the amount of SAPs you're running today. Now that is a high-level ballpark, and if you're ever wanting to do a real rudimentary thumbnail, I recommend that you get a firm in there that knows how to do SAP sizing, can look at your environment. If Managecore were in it, what we would do is we'd come in and really look at how your environment's running, and now's the right time to right-size your environment if you're going to do a migration to HANA. We would come in, and what you want to do is you want to look at how much CPU you're using today. Maybe your environment uses 80% CPU today, or maybe it uses 20%. And what this does is it gets you the opportunity to say, if my environment's 10,000 SAPs today, but I'm only using 20%, maybe I only need 3,000 or 4,000 SAPs to run it, and I only have to multiply it by 3 for that. So I can, instead of buying a 30,000 SAP appliance, I can buy a 12,000 SAP appliance, for example. And those are the type of things that are really good to do as you're trying to figure out, how do I convert my traditional SAP environment to HANA. There are equations that exist to calculate this. They are on the chart here. You can see that was from a VMware document, and what they do is effectively allow you to calculate how many vCPUs and how much memory you really need for these environments. And then there's processor SAPS ratings. So as in traditional SAP, each processor is certified for so many SAPs, and that SAPS rating you can convert per core. And then if you see the table on the right, you can see, again, the HANA version matters, and the CPU to RAM socket ratio matters. So, for example, just the first one, the Intel Xeon E7 V4, you can see for Suite on HANA, for SPS 11 or less, it's 768 gig, but for SPS 12 or greater, we're already at 124 gig per socket. And for BW on HANA, SPS 11 or greater, you're at 512. So you can see the size difference. From Suite on HANA to BW on HANA, just on that processor alone, it's only half the amount of memory you can use for BW versus Suite. So keep that in mind as you're sizing. Now focusing our shifts kind of from on-premise environments to cloud options, I'm going to go through the public cloud and private managed cloud options. So we'll start with private managed cloud. It is the most widely varying cloud offering for SAP HANA. You have any vendor out there that offers cloud. They on the back end could have a multitude of different configurations, and it could depend on the specific vendor or the specific deal. So you may have a situation where you go into one of these private managed clouds and they've made a solution custom tailored for you. And that may be something you need, but just something to keep cognizant about. You do have the potential to achieve real good flexibility and a cost-effective solution with the right partner, but again, do your homework when you review these private managed clouds. They can be the most tailorable, but don't confuse that with the most flexible cloud option. And what I mean by that is, again, it can vary based by vendor. So as these partners work with you to get a private managed cloud offering solution for you, what they'll do is you may have certain requirements that they've designed for you, but it may be outside the scope of a traditional quote-unquote cloud model, and they may have designed a specific solution for you that may not be as flexible, meaning the next time, although you have everything you need, the next time you want something to increase or decrease, it may be come with a high price tag. There are varying flexibility options, and again, they could be different underlying architectures. So going back to TDI versus appliance, the same rules must be followed by the cloud vendors. So depending on what your situation is and the particular cloud vendor on the back end, they could be doing a TDI model, which is generally the case, or they could be doing an appliance model, or they could be comboing both of them. The easiest way to determine that is to ask how and when you increase or decrease the environment, how will that impact the term and cost? Will you only have a slight increase in cost to slightly increase HANA, or is it a significant jump? Excuse me. Again, it generally requires less in-house knowledge, as the cloud vendor will provide the HANA infrastructure support and generally the OS and sometimes the database support. There's also varying different support models when it comes to that. So generally less in-house knowledge is required. Support models, though, are key differentiators between each vendor. You know, are they onshore? Are they offshore? Are they nearshore? Is there true 24/7 support? And what is the skill set of the team? On the back end, is there a single person that's certified to support HANA, or are there a multitude of individuals that understand the architecture and infrastructure? Really key questions and key criteria when you're looking at a private managed cloud. And also data center specifications should be considered when you go through that evaluation. Data center tiers for large public clouds are generally the best in the business because they have the best data centers out there. But tier and certifications do come to play with private managed cloud offerings. You want to make sure that they have the right certifications for you, whether it's ISO 27001, some SSAE or SOC type of certifications, and what's their tier? Are they tier 2 data centers or are they tier 4 data centers? Again, to reiterate, do your homework and understand what you are purchasing. There's different flavors, and each one could be different depending on your business case. I would say the key areas to ask when you are comparing are, is the infrastructure shared or dedicated? You know, are you an appliance model? Are you TDI? Where really are their infrastructure when it comes to what you're purchasing? And do they have HA and DR options? Some may not. And what does that mean from a pricing standpoint and architecture standpoint? And make sure they meet the KPIs. You want to make sure that the hardware is supported and certified by SAP, and that they're not white boxing it and it's not an allowed supported configuration. And that your private managed cloud vendor actually has the appropriate vendor support contracts on the back end. So although they may do a TDI model, if they're not in with the HANA COEs of those particular vendors, it's very hard to get the right and appropriate support when it comes time to fixing their hardware, which could cost you downtime. Now I'll kind of turn into the public cloud and give you a few different scenarios in that instance. There are actually fewer public clouds out there, as we all know, but they generally have more robust options in a private managed cloud. Those vendors, the Azures and the AWSs of the world and Googles, they bring the latest technology innovations with them, and some of them are just not feasible with smaller organizations. APIs, other infrastructure, so you may be looking to migrate some other infrastructure and your strategy is to eventually get to a public cloud, well, some of these public clouds might offer more in that scenario than your standard private managed cloud. And security is a major focus. So they oftentimes spend a lot more and invest a lot more infrastructure, people, energy, effort, and ultimately money into securing your environment. They are more flexible when it comes to payment options and terms. One of the main reasons people look at the cloud is because you can do a pay-as-you-go model. However, the big caveat is generally when you do that model, upfront the cost of those appliances or instances are generally higher. And that's why you have, in addition to pay-as-you-go, reserved and dedicated models. So you could save, 60% of the cloud cost if you were to reserve your instance for 1 or 3 year terms. And again, pricing can vary significantly based on it. From an HA and DR standpoint, they're much more robust. So public clouds, again, they're not going to offer a lot of the hands-on configuration of HA and DR. They're going to offer the back-end infrastructure. And what that means is they're going to offer many geographical regions. So if you want to run one in Australia and one in Europe and one in the U.S., you have the capability to do that and very quickly. It is up to you to configure it. And within those environments and those regions, they have multiple data centers. So, depending on the region you have, Australia may have 2 or 3 data centers there. Europe, depending on where you're at, may have the same thing with the U.S., and you could spread that out between different regions geographically and different data centers within that region. So very robust infrastructure. They are generally the most scalable of all the cloud options because you can spin up and down resources in minutes. You can deploy to those regions I was just mentioning very, very quickly with ease, and it's very painless to do so. And the vendors are investing in the technology, so you are benefiting with best of breed and best technologies out there, and they stay much more current than private managed clouds generally do. And again, different products. You could maybe need a database, an RDS solution with Oracle or SQL that you could run in that cloud, or analytics. Hadoop, for example, could be deployed in these clouds with very minimal effort and just as add-ons. The key with public cloud is that the skill set changes when you deploy in a public cloud. So in-house skill set, we're all accustomed to people that know SANs, that know networking. They may know a specific vendor. It changes with the cloud. You need an individual or individuals that understand how that architecture works, and it's specific to each different cloud. AWS is different than Azure. How you deploy that is different. How you configure an environment in those clouds are different. You really are deploying a virtual data center when you go into these public clouds, and you have to understand it from networking to the storage, the different types of storage. For example, with AWS, you have EBS storage and S3 storage, and where that comes into play and what you use that for. If you don't configure it correctly, you could, for example, if you configure storage wrong, you could actually turn off SAP, and when you turn it off, it actually erases everything you have there because you chose the wrong storage. So there's different caveats to it, and someone that knows that cloud is highly beneficial. And then public clouds offer the different certifications that you generally can't get, and the quantity of them that you wouldn't be able to get maybe by yourself or at certain private managed clouds because the cost or the time and effort and energy is too great to offer that. And some of them, such as PCI, ISO 27001, SOC, they're all pretty common. But then you get into the public cloud additional certifications that may be for Europe or Asia or potentially government. They have that, and they allow you to piggyback off of their certifications. From a public cloud standpoint, again, very easy to deploy and maintain. It's scripted from a HANA perspective. A lot of these bigger vendors, they offer the ability to spin up whole entire HANA instances in a matter of several minutes, but you can actually fill out templates that have the SID you drop the software for the database instance on their environment, and it reads all these directories and does the install, sets up the subnet, sets up the server, sets up the storage, does everything really, really automated. So really good when it comes to deploying. Everything's pretty much scripted, and you can do it in a matter of minutes. And again, each public cloud is different. Some offer different technologies. You may or may not need to take advantage of them, but definitely do your homework on the different public clouds. And there is a reference certified list, same place you go for checking any of these environments. And you can see the snapshot to the right. That is the public cloud offerings today. That is what's certified. Fairly small list. Amazon really has the majority of different platforms and different sizes. I will note that Microsoft Azure has one listed there. The reason being, again, is because their clouds are different. They do have something called large instances, and those large instances can grow to 4 terabytes, for example. However, it's a different support model. After that Azure 448 gig system, it really is dedicated hardware. They switch models to really dedicated almost appliances, but treat it as cloud. So just do your homework when deciding which cloud vendor to go with. And here's just a quick example of a layout, and just noting how it's a little different than your standard environment on-prem or a private managed cloud. You can see that this is just an AWS example, but you can see that there's a VPC, and that's basically your virtual data center. You have an internet gateway you connect to, and you have a public and private subnet, and that's how you communicate within each other. There are other avenues for connecting, but this is your straightforward, simple methodology. A lot of these cloud vendors, they actually now offer dedicated connections. So you don't have to you can do VPN tunnels, you can do straight through the internet, but they offer dedicated connections now, meaning you can drop your line to one of their drop points and really have a true extended data center network into a public cloud. So that technology is out there. So to summarize it, from a decision criteria standpoint, again, going through the 3, flexibility, supportability, and cost, I would say the public cloud offers the most options when it comes to infrastructure and pricing and terms and technology. It really is, from a flexibility and scalability standpoint, really hard to beat. But the private managed cloud, if you do your homework, can offer public cloud-like flexibility. But again, you really have to do your homework on which private managed cloud you choose. And then if on-premise, it's hard to beat the flexibility of TDI if you have hardware that already can support some HANA, right? Whether that may be a SAN or some compute that you might have that you could use. It really offers you on-prem flexibility. And supportability, cloud options are generally easier to support. You don't have to deal with the hardware. You don't have to deal with sometimes the OS and the database, the data center, right? Real estate, all that is kind of easier with the cloud. And some of the clouds have intuitive APIs. So with clicks of buttons, you can deploy servers instead of waiting a few weeks to order hardware, get the vendor in, and so on and so forth. In on-premise solutions will require the most support with TDI because you are commingling hardware and it's not a complete certified appliance. You generally will have the most support on-premise with a TDI model. And again, MSPs such as Managecore, we offer solutions that can fill those gaps for the in-house support. Understanding that HANA is new and there's not a lot of expertise out there in that realm, MSPs definitely can help fill that void. And from a cost perspective, a private managed cloud can often be more cost effective than a public cloud. A public cloud isn't the cheapest option. However, it can vary greatly between vendors. And remember, it's not the price you go in at with a private managed cloud, it's how you can scale. So when it comes time to increase and decrease, how big of a price jump is that? And that's something that you definitely should take into consideration. And then from an on-premise model, the TDI is generally the most cost-effective, assuming you have that hardware there for you already that you can use and it's certified for HANA. And again, how do these options stack against each other? I'm just reading from from left to right, the public cloud, the on-prem TDI model is generally the most cost-effective if you have some existing hardware. And from a public cloud standpoint, it is generally the most flexible, and from a support standpoint, it generally requires the least amount of support because everything's driven through APIs. It's generally really easy to deploy and stand up and spin up and down. Again, there are a lot of caveats to this. However, in general, this is how it would pan out. And if you see the private managed cloud option from that standpoint, you can get kind of the best of all the worlds if you find the right hardware vendor or private managed cloud vendor. And something different that Managecore likes to talk about is the virtual data center approach. So no one on the phone is probably going to make a leap into any type of cloud wholeheartedly with all their environment, right? It's either going to be maybe a production system you start with, maybe you start with a sandbox and queue, maybe it's just SAP. But now in this day and age, you really have to take that holistic view and say, I'm probably going to have some stuff in the public cloud. I'm probably going to have some environments in maybe Colo or my on-premise data center. I may have SAP in a private managed cloud, but choose to do other non-SAP workloads in a public cloud. And that's really where Managecore's vision is. You can do all that, and maintaining that and supporting that throughout your entire organization as one single entity is key. There's a lot of people out there that work remotely today, for example, and you're still part of the organization, and it still looks like you're sitting right next to someone with all the communication and technology available today. And that approach needs to be and is applied with Managecore to data center, right? Regardless of where it's at, one single pane of glass to see all of that and make it look like an entity, right? A virtual data center, regardless of location. And that wraps up my presentation around HANA architecture. We're going to go into Q&A now, so we will answer a few questions here. We'll kick off the kind of the message board, so please feel free to type exactly what the questions you have, and I promise if I don't get to them in time, I will gladly respond back via email and answer all your questions.